This is Death, Lies, and Alibis. Hello, I'm your host, Christy. Out here in rural Ohio, the nights are quiet, but not always peaceful. Every silence has a name, and every shadow has a story, and every cold case carries a weight you can feel if you stand still long enough. Today, we step into another one of those stories, forgotten by some and never forgotten by others. So, let's go together to where the questions are still hiding. What if the man convicted of murder didn't kill anyone at all? On October 12, 1979, Arthur Smith locked the doors of Rink's department store the way he always did. Lights off, deposit secured, and the alarm set. He called home at 9:30 p.m. "I'll be home soon," he said. But he never arrived. For 10 days, Logan County searched. Then Arthur was found. And from that moment forward, the story moved fast. Maybe too fast. A suspect, a conviction, and a life sentence. Nearly 5 decades later, the questions are still here. And some of them are louder now than they were in 1979. This story is of Arthur Smith and the case that nearly 50 years later may not be what it seems. Before Arthur Smith became a headline, before he became a case file, and before lawyers said his name in a courtroom, he was just a man living his life in Bellefonte, Ohio. He was a husband and a father. He wasn't flashy, he was just regular. He was the kind of man who didn't chase attention and he didn't need praise. He went to work, he handled his responsibilities, and he came home. He and Marianne were raising 5 children in a blended household. It was busy and structured, predictable in the best way. Dinner on the table, bills paid on time, and routines respected. What many people don't know is that Arthur spent years overseas in Africa. Hard work. He was long stretches away from home. He sent money back and he saved it and he protected it. And when he returned to Ohio, he didn't come back empty handed. He came back with real savings, money earned the hard way. He understood the value of a dollar. And people who knew him say they trusted him. He wasn't paranoid, but he did pay attention. When he carried the store deposits, his family says he tucked a small pistol into his sock. Not because he expected something bad to happen, but because he believed in being prepared. That was Arthur. If something didn't add up, if something didn't add up in his stores, he didn't ignore it. He would write it down and investigate. If procedures were loose, he noticed and he took action. And if inventory didn't make sense, well, he dug into it. That was his job. See, at Rinks, he wasn't just another manager. He was the guy they sent when any store in his district was slipping. And sometimes, especially in small towns, the person who refuses to look the other way becomes a problem because asking hard questions in the wrong place makes people uncomfortable. Now, hold that thought because it does connect to the next piece. Let's begin on Friday night, October 12th, 1979. Arthur Smith walked into Rinks the same way he always did, the same name tag, the same routine, the same checklist in his head. The day itself was described as just ordinary, but at some point that afternoon, Arthur was reportedly overheard arguing with someone on the phone. Now, it wasn't a casual conversation. The voices were raised and there was tension. We don't know who was on the other end, and we don't know what it was about, but it doesn't sound like a man having a peaceful day. Then, just before closing time, a man came back into the store. Now, earlier that day, he had bought the wrong gas cap. Now he was back to exchange it. And that man may have been the last confirmed person to see Arthur alive. And he wasn't just a random customer. He had recently been an employee that was fired by Arthur. And according to later reports, he was holding a grudge. A fired employee, alone in a store, minutes before Arthur vanished. That's not a small detail. But then employees were finishing up and registers counted, lights going off, doors getting ready to be locked. Arthur told the others he'd take care of the gas cap man, so they left and he stayed. Alone now, he moved into the final steps of closing. The safe was tied into the alarm system, something Arthur would set on his way out. And outside sat a red Volkswagen. But here's the point. That Volkswagen, it wasn't Arthur's usual vehicle. He normally drove a pickup truck. The VW belonged to his daughter, Kathy. He and Michael had been working on it, which is why he had it that night. Michael was his son. And parking it out there directly in the front of the store, that wasn't typical either. Now, layer this in. Earlier that day, Arthur had reportedly received his early bonus check. It was around $1,500. And he also had the night deposit. That was around $1,600. The night managers handled the deposits themselves. It stayed with them, whether they dropped it that night or the next morning. Now, at 9:30 p.m., Arthur called home. Marianne answered. It was brief. He just said, I'll be home. That was the last time anyone heard Arthur Smith's voice. Arthur didn't make it home. No accidents were reported. No struggle was witnessed at the store. No alarm was triggered. The store was closed properly. The safe was secure and the lights were off. On the surface, it looked like a normal Friday night had simply ended, but it hadn't. Somewhere between that 9:30 phone call and the drive home, something stopped a man who didn't deviate from routine. And when a routine man breaks pattern, you don't shrug it off, you trace it. Is the store, not the road home. The house stayed quiet. No headlights in the driveway, no engines were shutting off, and no front door opening. Marianne was looking for Arthur around midnight. Her first stop was at Rink's, and the store was locked, looked normal, dark and empty. The next stop was the bank. Nothing there. Then she went to the hospital. There was no accidents, no unidentified patients, no Arthur. Marianne eventually returned home. And later that evening, Kathy, their daughter, came home from the homecoming game with her boyfriend, David Price. Teenagers coming in late, a normal small town Friday night. Now, the next morning, Marianne called Arthur's son, Michael. They went to the Belfonte Police Department and they were told they had to wait 24 hours. Records indicate the formal missing persons report wasn't filed until Monday. That's 3 days later. And Arthur's daughter, Sheila, she wasn't even notified until then. 3 days. In a case where the first 24 hours matter the most. And in that waiting, whether it was confusion, disbelief, or something else, whatever happened to Arthur stayed undisturbed, untouched, and unrushed. 10 long days passed. 10 days of driving roads that led nowhere. 10 days of scanning ditches and fence lines. 10 days of waiting for a phone call that never came. And then, October 22nd, 1979, the silence broke. It wasn't a deputy who found him, and it wasn't a coordinated search team. It was a local farmer. Bert Luring was near his property along Township Road 179, close to State Route 10, when something caught his eye in a soybean field. At first, it didn't look like a man, just something wrong, something that didn't belong. He moved closer, and the shape became clearer, a body. Deputies were called. And when law enforcement arrived, Arthur Smith was lying in the open, not buried, not concealed in the woods, but visible on his side. His wrists and ankles were bound with wire. His shoes were removed, placed near his head, and there was no socks. He had been shot multiple times, and yet the scene, it didn't look chaotic. His wallet was still in his pocket. His ID cards, they hadn't been stripped away. But that deposit and his bonus check, they were never recovered. Now, his small pistol that Arthur always carried, it was missing and it was never found. And there's something else. Reports indicate there was little blood pulled into the soil at that scene. And that's unusual. And it may be a clue that he wasn't shot there at all. Then comes the detail that changes everything. Deputies had searched that field only the day before, and Arthur wasn't there. So either officers missed the body in an open bean field, or Arthur was brought there after the search. Because bodies don't show up in cleared locations. They're moved, they're placed, and they're left there. And if Arthur was placed in that field and not killed there, the entire case looks different because that stops looking like a robbery gone wrong and it starts looking like something controlled. And once you see it, it's hard to unsee it. For 3 years, Arthur Smith's murder had no suspect. There was no arrest, no physical evidence, and no clear direction. What investigators had was this: a body in a field, a Volkswagen found 3 days after Arthur went missing. It was parked behind Highland Hills Plaza Apartments on Lakewood Drive. That's right behind Rink's. The store safe was still holding thousands of dollars, and a timeline that just didn't add up clearly. But for 3 years, there was no who. Then, in 1982, nearly 3 years later, the case changed. George Skate's name surfaced, not at the crime scene, and not during the original investigation, but 3 years later. The state's theory, it became real simple. Arthur left work with money, he was robbed, he was killed, and George did it. But here's what they didn't have. There was no fingerprints tying George to the crime, no blood evidence, no weapon match, no physical evidence placing him in that bean field. What they did have was testimony. An inmate claimed George confessed to him while they were incarcerated. There wasn't any recording or any written statement, just a jailhouse confession. That inmate was James Rogers. And once a case finally has a name attached to it, well, then the whole machine starts moving. George had a criminal record. He wasn't a model citizen. But a person's reputation is not evidence. But in this case, reputation filled the gaps where there wasn't any proof. And from that point forward, the case rested on one thing: the word of a man serving decades in prison. And when freedom is on the table inside prison walls, stories become valuable. Before George Skates became a name tied to a murder case, he was just a man living in Logan County. He wasn't sophisticated. He wasn't the kind of person people pointed to as a role model. George lived on the edges of that small town world. He ran with biker circles, he dealt marijuana, and he had a criminal record. And let's be clear about that. George was not a perfect man, but he also was a husband and a father and a man with a family and a life beyond a case file. And there's a difference between being flawed and being a murderer. People knew him, described him as rough around the edges, but still someone who had relationships and responsibilities and a place in that community. He wasn't a stranger passing through town. He was a part of it. And that's the point. Because when investigators are under pressure to solve a case, they don't always look for correct suspects. They look for available ones. The one with a record. The one people already question. The ones who are easy to believe. Now, ask yourself this. If George had been a clean-cut businessman with no record, no rough reputation, would the case against him have looked the same? Or did who he was make it easier for people to accept that he must be guilty? Before we move into June of 1982, there's something you need to understand. At the beginning, this case was wide open. Prosecutor McGilvery's earlier notes list more than 60 potential suspects: neighbors, employees, known criminals, biker gangs, even family members. Several were polygraphed. Investigators were looking everywhere. So here's the name that surfaces early, and that's Jack Benton. See, George Skates and Jack Benton, they weren't strangers. They ran in the same biker circles, the same bars, the same crowds. And according to later findings and statements, Jack asked George for help, for some bail money, and George refused. Now, defense filings later argued Jack felt embarrassed. He was angry and humiliated. And when someone is sitting in prison looking for a way out, resentment can turn into leverage. Now, here's what matters most about Jack. Jack Benton was not at the crime scene. He wasn't there the night Arthur disappeared. He was friends with Jimmy and Diane Rogers, and Jack wanted out of prison. And Jimmy did too. Records show Jack was the first to contact prosecutor Doug McGilvery, and he made a deal. Jack reportedly received immunity connected to his cooperation. He was given a job, he was provided an apartment, and he was granted shock probation. We have records and documents, even though later filings question whether he was eligible at the time. Now, after Jack cooperated, Jimmy came forward. That order is documented too. This doesn't answer who killed Arthur, but it does tell you how the case found its path. In a murder case built largely on just testimony, timing matters, deals matter, eligibility sure matters. Because when someone stands to gain something, well, that gain becomes part of the story. Now let's talk about Jimmy. Jimmy Rogers wasn't just any inmate. When he began cooperating, he was facing more than 15 counts. 15 counts. Aggravated robbery, assault, and rape charges, plus more. He was already serving, listen please, 37 to 130 years. I mean, you might as well say life. He had a life sentence. He had a prior convictions for lying under oath, and his legal exposure was growing. Now, he didn't come forward right after Arthur's murder. He came forward after new indictments were pending against him, after pressure was increased. And at this point in the investigation, it's worth stepping back for a moment. Listen, what did investigators actually have? Well, here's what the case looked like. Arthur Smith had been murdered. His vehicle and personal items raised questions. There were theories about robbery, but the evidence was thin. And investigators were still searching for someone who could place a suspect directly at the scene. Handwritten notes appear to show prosecutors tracking what Rogers would say before testimony. A 1985 statement from fellow inmate claims Rogers admitted he was pressured and agreed to testify to avoid harsher charges. And Jimmy did not stay in prison for life. Now ask yourself, what would that change? Jimmy got out of jail. He got deals. He was facing a life sentence for harsh felonies. And he left jail. He walked out. Ask yourself what that would change if he would have stayed in. The courtroom feels smaller than it should. Wood benches creak. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. A cough from the gallery. Jurors shifting in their seats. The bailiff calls it State of Ohio versus George Skates. The prosecution rises and calls their cornerstone witness, James R. Rogers. Chains clink softly as Jimmy Rogers is led into the stand. He raises his right hand and is sworn in. The prosecutor approaches. Mr. Rogers, did George Skates ever confess to you? The room stills. Yes, Jimmy says. He told me he killed Arthur Smith. Defense counsel stands. Objection, hearsay. The judge leans forward. Overruled. Jimmy continues. Now, there is no recording at this time. It's not introduced anytime. There's no written confession that's introduced, and there's no physical evidence attached to the statement, just the testimony. One inmate describing a conversation inside jail walls. Now, next is Diane Rogers. That's Jimmy's wife. Diane had legal troubles of her own. She had prior perjury conviction. She also received immunity connected to her cooperation. Court records later reflected financial assistance from the prosecutor's office. Now, the jury heard consistencies. They did not hear the full scope of benefits that Diane received. Next comes Becky Boop, and she takes the stand. At the time, she was involved with an affair with Jimmy. And on cross, the truth lands hard with her. You admitted holding victims at gunpoint? Yes. You cased Rinks? Yes. A murmur rolls through the gallery. Next comes a name, and he is in cuffs, and this is Danny Stanley. Now, after the conviction, he stepped forward, and under oath, he said something that should have shaken this entire case. He said Jimmy Rogers admitted George had nothing to do with it. But that didn't reopen the case, and it didn't change the outcome. Instead, Danny Stanley was punished, and the conviction stayed exactly where it was. Now, court records reflect discussions between prosecutors and a sentencing judge about possible arrangements. Now, this was on cooperation and testimony against George. We have these documents. We have a lot of documents. Now, like I said, this isn't speculation. It's on record. Now, next is Jack Benton. He's on the stand. And the defense presses hard. Mr. Benton, were you granted shock probation? Yes. You had ties to Rinks? Yes. Objection. Sustained. What the jury sees is a structure. There's Jimmy and Diane, Becky, Danny, and Jack. All of them. Reinforcement, consistency, and they were competent. The judge instructs the jury. You are the sole judges of credibility. They nod. Now strip it down. And what is holding this case up? It's testimony. 5 hours. That's how long deliberations lasted. Then the jury returns. All rise. The judge reads. We, the jury, find the defendant, George Skates, guilty. Guilty. There wasn't an outburst. There was no shouting. Just the sound of breath leaving the room. Life. Not months. Not years. George got life. And he sits still. Deputies step forward. And this time, the chains are not symbolic. They click into place. And George Skates is led out of that courtroom. The doors close behind him, and the verdict is in. But outside those walls, the questions don't disappear, because verdicts are supposed to bring certainty, clarity, and closure. But this one didn't. And a case built on just testimony alone, that can be louder than anything said under oath. Arthur Smith left work that night, and he said he'd be home soon, but he never made it. And 47 years later, the field is still there. The store's gone. The headlines have faded, but the questions haven't. A conviction built on questionable testimony, supported by witnesses with bonuses given to them, immunity, and possible grudges. There's no DNA, no real eyewitnesses, no weapon, no physical evidence publicly tying George Skates to that field. Just testimony. This evidence wasn't about proving George's innocence. It was about laying out the crime and the accusations that put him away. But what if the jury never saw the full picture? That's not closure. That's not justice. That's the setup for doubt. And doubt is where we head next. If you lived in Logan County in 1979, if you worked at Rinks, if you were in law enforcement, if you heard things back then that never sat right, now is the time. Memories fade, files disappear, and people move on. But the truth never expires. In our next episode, we're going into what the jury never heard and why that is important. Because sometimes the most important parts of a case are the ones that's left in the shadows. Arthur Smith deserves the truth. And whether that truth confirms the conviction or it shatters it, it deserves to be fully known. Because if a wrong man was convicted, then the person responsible for Arthur Smith's murder has been free for decades. Okay, as we wind up, folks, I want to remind you that everyone named here is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Death, lies, and alibis is for information and educational purposes only. I'm not a professional. I gather very public information and I present it to you for you to do your own research and form your own opinions. So that's it for this episode of Death, Lies, and Alibis. The story stops here for now, but the questions don't. Cold cases don't fall on their own. It takes attention, pressure, and the willingness to care when others don't. Hit the follow button on the podcast so you never miss the next episode. Join our Facebook group for documents, case files, and ways to get involved, or email me at deathliesalibis@gmail.com. And as always, be safe, stay alert, and never stop seeking justice.